So in my last video I talked about Carl Wendlinger's crash at Monaco in 1994 and how Formula 1 didn't need that in the wake of the two fatal accidents that had come at the previous Grand Prix, which is the famous for all the wrong reasons 1994 San Marino Grand Prix. And we all know what happened there. 3 days, 3 major crashes, and while there wasn't 3 deaths, there easily could have been. Rubens Barrichello able to get away alive, but not without Professor Sid Watkins' intervention. And it's lucky that Rubens crashed towards the end of the lap, because time would have been against Sid if he had to rush to somewhere like Acqua Minerale corner, which was over the back end of the lap. But that wasn't even the beginning or the end of things. As we saw in the previous video, Carl Wendlinger had suffered his accident at Monaco, which led to the high cockpit size that we started seeing as a mandatory safety feature on Formula 1 cars in 1996. But in that last video I alluded to the fact in a quite scary manner that Formula 1 could have had more than just the 2 deaths that happened at the San Marino Grand Prix. Up to the Spanish Grand Prix, those 2 deaths could have easily been 5, which when you work out an average, it amounts to 1 death every single race weekend. One of the big changes for 1994 was the hasty banning of the electronic driver aids on the cars that had been a big part of 1993. Williams and McLaren had 2 of the most technologically advanced Formula 1 cars ever built, with traction control, anti-lock brakes, active suspension and fully automated gearboxes that essentially meant that the drivers just had to point the car in the direction they wanted to go and yeet it. Fearing that a bug in the system could cause a catastrophic accident if the systems were to crash, FIA President Max Mosley announced at the 1993 Canadian Grand Prix that the teams had to get rid of them for 1994. Which was not necessarily a good thing, given that the top teams would have already been a decent way into developing their 1994 cars. But it is what it is. Those driver aids had to go for 1994, besides power steering and flappy paddle sequential gearboxes. Although that said, the back of the grid teams such as Simtech would still have H-pattern gearboxes through 1994, and it wasn't until the end of 1995 that H-patterns disappeared from Formula 1 altogether. 40, for reference, is the last team to have one. But it did cause some concern amongst the teams and drivers that if they were banned too quickly instead of being phased out, then there would be problems. And in the January of 1994, the problems started. JJ Lehto had joined Benetton to be the partner of Michael Schumacher. Lehto had beaten Michele Alboreto to the seat, and with the progress Benetton had been making over the last couple of years and with Lehto's own talent, Benetton must have been expecting both drivers to be making regular trips to the podium and grabbing a couple of wins here and there, which obviously would depend on what kind of thing Williams had come up with, since they still had Renault V10 power and they'd just signed Ayrton Senna to drive for them. The previous iteration of the Benetton had been pretty quick in Schumacher's hands, so it was up to Lehto to get within a decent margin. Lehto was considered a rising star, and 1982 champion Keke Rosberg was a massive backer of the Finn, and Lehto had spent a few years milling around in the mid to back of the pack. His career had taken him from Onyx, where he struggled to either qualify or finish a race, and then ended up at Scuderia Italia, or the Dallara team, depending on which results sheets you want to read, and that was in 1991. There, he managed to bag a podium at Imola, which were the only points he'd score over the 2 years there, but then in 1992, he'd finish in the lower part or just outside the top 10, which is still pretty decent all things considered. He would then get 2 points finishes in 1993 at South Africa and Imola while at Sauber, after which he got the Benetton drive. But the golden ticket ended up being some sort of curse for him, because before he could even get going, the accident happened, and Lehto would never show the world what he was truly capable of. At Silverstone in the January of 1994, Lehto was driving the older B193 Benetton. He'd beaten around 8 other drivers to land that seat, one of which we already established was Alboreto, so it would be interesting to see who the others were. But Lehto left the road at around 220 km an hour, which is around 135 in old money. The location of that accident was Stowe, where, ironically, his teammate for the 1994 season, Michael Schumacher, would suffer a massive crash there 5 years later. As Lehto turned in, the car left the road and went into a wall. He was briefly knocked out, but woke up with a broken neck. The cockpits of that time, as some pointed out in the last video, were incredibly exposed. You could see the driver's shoulders in most cases, and there was no hands device, so whiplash-related injuries, either side to side or tweaking the head forward violently, was always a risk, especially in high-speed accidents. But that's just how Formula 1 cars had developed. If you go out and drive any performance car on a track, you'll get a taste of the acceleration and braking performance, even while wearing a hands device. And take it from me, those things are not the most comfortable things in the world to wear, but you are thankful for them when you do hit the brakes. In a high-performance downforce car, when you put your foot down, you see sky, and when you hit the brakes, you're able to see your own arsehole. In the accident, some bone had splintered off the vertebra in his neck, 2 of the vertebrae in his neck that is, and gone actually into his spinal cord. If it had gone any deeper, he would have been paralysed from the neck down, or killed. It was an utterly horrendous accident to have, but Bernie Eccleston, Sid Watkins and Flavio Briatore managed to get JJ the best care he could possibly get so that he could recover properly. 2 of the vertebrae in his neck had been crushed, and doctors said that it would be 6 months before he would return to just a normal life, let alone racing. But in 3 months, JJ was back in a Formula 1 car at that fateful weekend at Imola. And his performance was okay, all things considered. He was in 5th for the start of the Grand Prix, but over a second off Schumacher's time across the 2 sessions. But then, this was an era where the car at the back of the field could be 5 or 6 seconds off the pace. But as David Coulthard said, the first opponent is your teammate. But you can forgive him a bit because, well, the broken neck. And JJ was already racing under a degree of trepidation because his friend Roland Ratzenberger had been killed on Saturday. At the start of the race, Lehto stalled his Benetton and was then hit by Pedro Lamy's Lotus, and we'll get to Lamy in a little bit. And the debris that went everywhere ended up in the crowd and injured 8 people and a police officer, as well as tweaking the neck injury that Lehto had suffered at Silverstone back in January. He was okay to race at Monaco, but the injury had really done a number on him. He was 4 seconds off the Michael at Monaco, the bumpy circuit playing havoc with his neck, and it resulted in the massive disparity between his Imola and Monaco lap times. During testing at Silverstone, he often had to look at the wheel to see if his hands were still on it because he couldn't feel his arms and hands sometimes. He did recover to finish 7th in the Grand Prix through retirements and pit stops, and then retired at Spain after running 4th for a good chunk of the race. He scored 1 point in Canada, but only because Christian Fittipaldi was disqualified, and then Verstappen was put back in the car. When Schumacher was serving his race bans, Lehto went back into the car to partner Verstappen for Italy and Portugal, but was comprehensively beaten by Jos the Boss. Briatore had no real choice but to let him go, but Lehto did do some testing for Ligier, which Briatore now had an interest in, where he learned about the Renault engines for him. But Lehto's accident was one of 3 major testing accidents in 1994. Mugello. Like Monza and the 1994 layout of Imola, it was fast as hell. Well, it still is. Sweeping corners and a very long pit straight that Ferrari, the circuit's owners, love to use for straight line testing. The final corner, being what it is, allows for cars to hit insane speeds before braking for turn 1. On top of this, the circuit has a very fast section over the back end of the track, turns 6, 7, 8 and 9 being a good test of downforce and how much life your tyres have got left. After the first round of the season in Brazil, Ferrari had gone to Mugello for some testing, and Alesi was out there in the 1994 car turning some laps. As he entered the Arrabbiata corner, of which there are 2 on this track map that I have, so it was either turn 8 or turn 9, but I think it was 8, he lost control of the car and smashed into the wall. And Alesi was a bit luckier than Lehto because he only suffered a compression of his vertebra that caused him to lose feeling in his left arm for a little bit. Ferrari would bring in their test driver Nicola Larini for the races in Japan and Italy, with Larini scoring a podium at Imola. But the third testing accident, that's a case of how the hell did he survive? After the Monaco Grand Prix weekend where Wendlinger was on a hospital bed in a coma, Lotus had gone to Silverstone with Pedro Lamy and Johnny Herbert to do some testing of their own. The days when the teams could just do that. And Lotus, at the time, was in deep financial trouble. The post-Chapman years really hitting hard at this point, but Lotus was still persevering. But the reason Lotus was there is because Mosley, in the wake of the accidents at Imola and the 2 already massive testing accidents, had decided to implement more changes before something else went horribly wrong. Formula 1 had seen 2 deaths in as many days at Imola, and now it was looking down the barrel of 3 drivers over just 2 race weekends. These changes, which involved changes to the airbox to reduce power, less bodywork around the rear of the car and changes to the diffusers, underfloor and front wings, along with new ride height restrictions, would have to be designed, built, tested and then used competitively, all within 2 weeks. The plank would debut at Hockenheim and the reduction from 3.5 to 3 litres would happen for the start of 1995. 2 weeks to do new airboxes, rear assemblies and front wings. For Williams, Ferrari, McLaren and Benetton, that was doable, but would cause a lot of headaches even with their budgets. But for Lotus, who were barely scraping by, this was going to be much worse. On top of this, none of the designers from Adrian Newey, Rory Byrne and Neil Oatley at the top to Nick Worth, Adrian Reynard and Aldo Costa down at the bottom were consulted about these changes before they were announced. They felt that these changes, much like the hasty banning of the 1993 driver aids, would cause more problems than they'd solve, simply because of the time frame to get them done and the resources that the smaller teams did not have. As a measure as to how doomed Lotus was in this era, they'd started the 1994 season with a reworked version of the 1993 car, which in turn was a reworked version of the 1992 car. The car was often referred to as a rebadged Leighton House, as the designer, Chris Murphy, had joined from Leighton House after Akira Akagi's arrest. While it was a nice car to drive according to Johnny Herbert, its reliability was its undoing. But by 1994 the reliability had improved, and the Mugen Honda engine wasn't the most powerful engine on the grid, but at least they were finishing races, with Lamy retiring from the San Marino Grand Prix in that start line collision with Lehto, and Herbert retiring at Monaco. From the Spanish Grand Prix onwards, Herbert would get the new 1994 car, which would end up being Lotus's last Formula 1 car, the 109. Lotus had taken Lamy's car and made some modifications to the diffuser to get rid of some of the downforce, as the FIA had now revised the size they could be. It has to be said here that the FIA had been, well, I wouldn't say generous with the timeline, but when I said they had to get stuff changed in 2 weeks, they had to have the new diffusers and front wings done by Spain, but the new airboxes sorted by Canada. Whether some of the teams tried to do all the changes in one go, I'm not sure, simply because if you were allowed more power for Barcelona, it would make sense to have that power, but the aero changes had to be done in time for the Spanish Grand Prix. Supposedly, Lotus had also made changes to the floor as well as the diffuser, probably in anticipation of the plank that was to come in time for Hockenheim. On Wednesday the 25th of May 1994, which is Mrs. Millward's birthday as it so happens, the Independent newspaper reported that there had been an accident at Silverstone, an accident described as horrifying. Lamy had been driving around with Herbert when something broke on his car in between Abbey and Bridge. At the time of the test, Abbey was a kink to the left, as opposed to the fast right-hander that it is now. At some point between exiting Abbey and arriving at Bridge, Lamy had spun, and then gained lift, almost like those old NASCAR crashes, and then hit a wall on the left-hand side of the track. The tub, by which point was the only part of the car still in one piece, somehow ended up vaulting a fence, skidded along a path, and somehow ended up in a tunnel that allowed its spectators to access the other side of the bridge. Now I've driven over the bridge at Bridge Corner. How Lamy didn't hit the bridge with his head or hit something else with his head or otherwise be killed, I will never know, because that entire portion of the track, as short as it is incredibly hemmed in. He ended up in this tunnel here, so he's a very lucky man either way. It's also a good thing that this was a test session and not a race weekend, because that part of the track used to have a lot of people around it. But either way, if you're in that car, which at the time was that exposed in terms of the cockpit, and you end up becoming a V10 powered artillery shell, you must have been thinking in that brief moment while you're getting air that it must have been the end. Again, how he survived, I will never know. And Johnny Herbert wasn't that far behind him at the time. He said, "I'd been following Pedro about 100 yards behind when his car spun. There was lots of dust and it just took off. I stopped my car and jumped out, but at first I couldn't find him. Then I could see the tub had been thrown onto the other side of the fence. I couldn't believe it. He was halfway down the tunnel. The back end of the car was on fire. Even his helmet was steaming. The marshals soon appeared and I helped him put out the fire. I didn't really want to go in there, but I had to. I feared the worst after what's happened recently." He was unconscious when I got to him, but he gradually came to. He was breathing heavily and obviously in pain. They put his legs in splints and carried him to the helicopter to be taken to hospital. It was as horrifying as any of the recent accidents we've had. The accident made news on both sides of the Atlantic. Nigel Mansell, who was racing in the United States at the time, was due to come back to Formula 1 to help Williams with the constructors' battle, but Carl Haas, his boss at the time, was urging him not to go back because of how dangerous Formula 1 had become. And this was coming from somebody in kart, where the cars were powered by methanol and they were nudging 250 miles an hour at Indianapolis. But either way, Lamy's accident had raised a lot of questions about circuit safety. The fence was 10 feet high and Lamy had cleared it like he was Mondo Duplantis. The circuit immediately began an investigation into whether the fence was too low or if this was all just a freak accident. and with spectators in the vicinity during a race weekend, there was a possibility it could happen again and be even more catastrophic, with lost lives. That portion of the track wasn't seen as being particularly dangerous, but with Lamy's accident it raised questions as to what might happen if a Peter Dumbreck-style accident was to happen and the car hit the bridge, or if a car hit a slow car unsighted and a Mark Webber-style accident like the one he had at Valencia happened, where a car could also hit the bridge. Derek Warwick was sent by the GPDA to investigate the track prior to the British Grand Prix, and the small crest that was between Abbey and Bridge could mean that a car could get air if the wrong thing was to happen. But amazingly, considering what happened, Lamy escaped with only 2 broken kneecaps and a fractured thigh. There's a picture of what was left of the tub floating around on the internet that I can't put in the video because of copyright, which I know sucks, but from what I can decipher, the front of the tub was ripped clean off. I think Lamy's legs would have been hanging out of the car. When Herbert said there was nothing left, there was nothing left. They reckon it was a bolt on the rear of the car that just sheared clean off and the rear wing just flew off. Lamy travelled about 150 metres further forward, where he veered towards the left-hand side of the track, hit the fence, vaulted over it, and then ended up in that tunnel. I can't find the exact timeline, but Silverstone made some changes that were complete in time for the Grand Prix in July. Copse and Stowe were tightened, as was the entry into the Vale. Priory Corner was moved forward, with the changes being somewhat reverted by 1996 or 1997, as the circuit looked at ways of restoring the old flow and upping the speeds as the safety changes took effect. A chicane was added at Abbey that was done in response to the Lamy crash, which lasted until the 2010 redesign. But whether the whole lot was done in response or just the chicane, I can't find the details. Considering they were testing there just 2 months prior to the race, the changes must have already been done elsewhere or were about to be done. If anybody knows, do let me know, but judging from a track map from the time of the accident, I don't think they changed the whole track yet. But the 3 big testing accidents showed that Formula 1 in 1994 was a season that many will want to forget. Lehto's promising career in the sport was effectively ended before he had a chance to prove himself, only having 2 extra outings with Sauber at the end of the season, while Alesi suffered a setback with his neck injury. Then you've got Lamy, exceptionally lucky to be alive, but rejoined Formula 1 in 1995 with Minardi at the Hungarian Grand Prix and was there for the entirety of 1996, being the only Minardi driver to be there for the whole of 1996, as the team relied on the money from Fisichella, Lavargi and Tarso Marquez just to survive. The Lamy crash had lasting repercussions on Formula 1 in regards to circuit design. Most of the stuff that you see on modern circuits today has come in part due to the Lamy crash. But at least after the Canadian Grand Prix of 1994, Formula 1 could breathe a collective sigh of relief. So then, a look at the 3 major testing accidents at Silverstone and Mugello in 1994. If this has cleared some bits and pieces up for you, then do like the video so I know a good job was done, and for more stuff from this channel then by all means subscribe and get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else to do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and membership so you can do Patreon without going to Patreon. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.